All right, welcome everybody. My name is Mark Thomas. I want to do a real quick sound check with the panelists. Can you guys hear me okay out there?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Great.
Clear,
Yes.
Mark.
5
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks for joining, everyone. Hey, everybody out there, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. You may have seen on some of the social media posts and some of the things that we were talking about as we were trying to market and get the word out on this webinar series. This really all started a couple of months ago. I had to reach out to some colleagues of mine because I was at a board meeting, and this board of directors at a client asked me point blank, what does this thing called ESG have to do with us? And really, how does it really affect our IT governance? And so, as luck would have it, a lot of my colleagues are uniquely qualified to discuss this very subject. So we ended up with a pretty talented group of global professionals who are ready to share some of their knowledge and their expertise on this subject that we call ESG, or environmental and social governance. So we're publishing a series of these 4 webinars for you to help you understand the what, the so what, and the now what of ESG, and help governing bodies understand what this is, especially in the rapidly changing environment that we're up against today. So this panel series has, of course, a collective expertise, and these guests are really going to make a big difference. They're colleagues of mine and friends of mine. So every one of the sessions is really checking what we call the heartbeat of our ability to be sustainable and really make sure that we have positive impact on the world. So I'm going to jump ahead here. And when you look at what the webinar series is all about, we have 4 of these. You might have seen a couple links out there on LinkedIn or Twitter. We're going to kick this thing off with a high level. We call this ECG on ESG. So we're talking about the heartbeat here. After this, we have 3 more. We'll talk about environmental, we'll talk about social, and then we'll wrap this up, really kind of putting this under the governance umbrella for you guys. But today we're going to start off with an ECG on ESG. So let's take a look at what this looks like today. You've probably seen this out on LinkedIn. We're really here, like it says on the text, we're setting this baseline for ESG because a lot of folks really don't know what it is. I barely knew what it was a couple of years ago. And we're really starting to see a lot of information, hit LinkedIn, hit the internet and Twitter, and hashtag ESG seems to be pretty popular. So a lot of things are shifting in the world. So we want to really try to understand the context of ESG. And those are the things we're going to be talking about in this first webinar. So you see my esteemed colleagues over here on the right. We do have a global panel of folks that are going to be talking to us today. My name is Mark Thomas. I'm coming to you today from Phoenix, Arizona. We've got Manny coming to us from Iowa, U.S. Karen is coming to us from New Mexico, U.S. Simone is our Australian. She's coming to us, though, by way of France. Charlene Watson will be joining us here in a second. Charlene, just in the last couple of days, finished her move into Phoenix, Arizona, so we'll have her joining us soon. Eduardo's coming from the state of Washington. Rocky is coming from Indonesia. We've got Tim Clements coming from Denmark. Turhan is from Turkey. Zane is coming to us from the UAE. So that's what the panel looks like here. So I'm sure you recognize most, if not all, of these folks. But by the way, this is an unsponsored event. We're here as colleagues sharing information. Our goal is to share thoughts and ideas with you and each other. So feel free to reach out to any one of these experts on the side. You've got access to their email, and you can continue any conversation with any of them that you'd like. Okay, so let's jump in and let's talk about what we're going to be doing in this panel for you guys today. We're scheduled to go about an hour and a half. And, I realized that I didn't put that on any of the information out there, but we will be recording this. So each of us will have a chance to put this out on our social media. And if you can't make the whole thing, you'll be able to go and catch at least the last part of it afterwards. So what you'll see is I have a series of panelist questions that are really going to create some discussion. And then we'll jump in and towards the end and see if we have a couple of polls in here as well. But we do have a Q&A session for any of you guys that have any questions. Feel free to use that Q&A box. We'll keep an eye on the Q&A box, but sometimes it's helpful if there's a question that you have for a specific panelist just go ahead and put their name in that too, so we can keep an eye on that. And we may not be able to get to all questions, of course, because of the timing, because we want to be time conscious. If you've never heard these panelists talk, you will quickly find out that an hour and a half might not be enough time for these folks to get all their information out there. So, all right, like I said before, we are doing a recording on this, and you'll get a chance to take a look at it a little bit later. But before we get going, I'm going to try something new. I've never done a poll on one of these things. So I'm going to launch a poll and see if this thing actually works. So you guys can tell me if you can see this poll. And the first question is, hey, is your organization adopting ESG practices? Give you a second to take a look at that. All right. Looks like most of us are in. You guys are quick on this one. So go ahead and end the poll so you guys could take a look at this one. So now it should publish for you. All right. I can share the results. Now you should be able to see this. Interesting, right? And that doesn't really surprise me much. I don't know if this surprises any of you on the panel. We don't have anybody that's saying, yes, we are consciously adopting this, but a lot of organizations are considering that. This webinar will be specifically helpful for you, because now we're going to be talking about some very high-level concepts and focus points of ESG, because I think if you read a lot of the articles out there, it sounds like it's a financial measure only, or a way for somebody to gauge an investment. But that couldn't be further from the truth. So hopefully this will help you guys out a little bit. And let's jump in. I'm going to stop sharing that poll, and let's go ahead and let's jump right in.
Share those results now if you like.
Oh, I was sharing them. Hold on, let me go back. Thank you. Share results. It says I'm sharing. Can you see them?
All right. Yep. Gotcha.
There we go. Now you guys can see them. So yeah, like I said before, it's no surprise that we don't have anybody saying, yeah, we're in on this thing. But what do you guys think about that? Does that surprise any of you guys out on the panel at all?
It was the don't know that got me.
Yeah.
Not really.
Scary.
Yeah. So again, we've got just under half are saying, yeah, we're considering it, and or don't know, or not even planning on it. Well, good. All right, not good, but let's that'll give us some good conversation points. So I'm going to jump out, stop sharing that, and guys, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go around the table first. We're going to start with all the panelists, and you guys can open up and answer as you please. Tell you guys what, I'm going to reach out. I will tell you that it wasn't long ago, I really didn't know a whole lot about ESG. So if someone were to ask you, hey, what's your elevator speech on what this thing called ESG is, what would you say? Anybody can kick this off.
Well, Mark, I would say that it's a set of criteria that makes up a lens that's being used more and more to scrutinize organizations. And this is organizations of all sorts, profit and not for profit. And it's really a way to gauge how well those organizations are serving a social purpose.
Ah, all right. Anybody else?
Yes, I have. I think it's an ongoing program integrated into business activities, investment initiatives to conduct environmentally and socially responsible and well-governed business. It has three domains, which is environmental area, which is how the business impact the environment, how to contribute to future generations, how do we conserve the natural world. Then we have another perspective, which is called social side. That means how the business contribute to its community, to its employees, to its customers, to its partners, how the company share its returns to these people, how the consideration of the people and the relationships. Then we have the third domain, how well the company is governing itself. So with these three domains, we think this is an ongoing program. For any activities and any things we do, it is integrated into. So this is what should I say about the ESG?
So let me stay on that one for a second, Turhan, because I want to keep a hold of you for a minute on this, because you were talking about having three domains, three areas of this. So it sounded like you were explaining a framework to me, but I'm going to get to my question here in a second. So So like me, a lot of folks in the audience may have really not have heard of this until they signed up for the webinar. Is this thing called ESG? And I'll get back to the panel on your thoughts on this. Is this thing called ESG? Is it a framework, or is it an international standard? Is it criteria? Is it a model? How would you describe that?
Well, actually, it is none of them. It uses the frameworks, it uses the factors, it uses the models, it uses the standards, but it's not one of them. I should say it's an ongoing program.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Anybody else have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah,
Mark,
all right, looks
can I
like
take a stab at it?
Go for
Go
it,
ahead,
Zane. Zane, it's you.
Yeah, so I think that because it's an evolving area, it isn't really well defined in a lot of organizations. There isn't a standard, there isn't a specific framework, there aren't any really published articles to say this is what ESG, because it's different things to different people, and it's different things to different organizations. And so it is an evolving kind of, I want to say, gray area that organizations need to be understanding of. And I think Simone might have a better deep dive into that than I would.
You mean Simone might have an opinion on this? Simone, do you have an opinion on that?
I was just going to say the reality is we live in the grey. I just hope it's not smog. But I really think that, ESG, it's really about the decisions about our future viability. So I think there's more conceptual understanding around it. There are specifics, what environment, what social, and what governance are, but it's not one thing in particular. I think ESG is our human values, a very part of every organization's decision making. Mm-hmm. And because it's based on our values, ESG is something there are values expressed on a physical level because there's an impact from those things. So I think that's what it is.
I would like to piggyback off of what Simone is saying, because I agree with her. It is very much based on our human values. But some of those values are what I would call principles. For instance, principles are different from values. Values can change based on cultural history and where a person is in their life or where they're from. But principles will not change. Principles of having a viable environment to live in, principles of having our data being private and our ability to protect our identity, principles of caring for each other and providing social justice. Those aren't values. They don't shift. And companies are struggling to find that balance of making a profit and still being environmentally and socially conscious. So that's why there's so much gray. Additionally, it's advertising fuel, because a company can say we're environmentally conscious, we're socially conscious, and look at these things that we're doing. Well, are you really doing those? So in the United States, taking cybersecurity as an example, laws came out that required companies to have a cybersecurity expert on their board. And for a while, that was not defined. What is a cybersecurity expert? Well, the SEC came out and said, okay, this is a cybersecurity expert. This is what you have to show as a profit company, what you have done to be cyber resilient. The same thing is now happening with environmental social governance. The SEC is taking a hard look at companies that claim we're environmentally and socially conscious. We have ESG. And so they're struggling to wrap hard definitions around it.
Can I piggyback here, Mark?
Go ahead, Eduardo.
Yeah.
And I like the point that you make about avoiding just using this as advertisement or just marketing. And that's a term that we've been hearing, that's avoiding to greenwash. Just what happened with sustainability in the recent past. And ESG, some say that it's an evolution of corporate sustainability, corporate responsibility. It is about the principles. It's not just saying we are doing this just because we want PR. This is not a PR stunt. This is for the long term. That's why it might take longer than initially thought to have a common understanding around what environmental, social, and governance criteria is across the globe. So it's not new. We saw this happening, like you mentioned, Charlene, with cybersecurity, with even with the G of the SDG, the governance part.
Absolutely.
What we are trying to achieve, how to be responsible, and we are going to cover a little bit down the road here in this webinar. But it's expanding the focus from just the stockholders to the shareholders to the stakeholders.
Mhm.
Is everybody is have an eye on the large organizations that are focusing on ESG, so that they will not be allowed to use just ESG as advertisement, ESG as a PR stunt.
So we've heard of some awesome stuff here. So Tim, you're coming from a whole other part. We're hearing from U.S. folks. What are you guys thinking out there in your area around Denmark?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, Mark, I mean, I build upon everything that everyone said up until now. I totally agree with that. Just from my perspective, I would describe it as it's going beyond compliance. What typical traditional compliance with laws, regulations, and so on. So and a lot of companies, we can pin various initiatives against the pillars as Tohan mentioned. And as we'll talk about later on, there has been this evolution that, as Wado mentioned. So I don't think it's something new. I'm not saying it's a gimmick. It's just rebranding or a repackaging of something that's been around. But I see it as more of an evolution. But from my perspective, the way I tend to describe it is, in many cases, it's going beyond a normal compliance initiative. Thank you.
That makes sense. Hey, Manny, did you have a piece to add on that one?
I do. In fact, it was very interesting when this panel started describing ESGs with the different lenses around here. And there were 2 or 3 key words which basically jumped out. One was the impact. What is ESG doing in the 3 different areas from an impact standpoint? The other thing was value creation. Now, one of the things that we have to understand, and as everybody pointed out, ESG is not new. ESGs existed in different forms over the years. The term first actually came up in 2004, when in literature, when people started kind of using this as a specific area or a focus area. But what has happened over the period of time is companies started taking them into their strategic and operational decision making to create the long-term value. And that's where what is pivotal, in terms of how we've started looking at it. Now, a question that might come to people's mind is, well, if it's been there since 2004, why are we talking about it now? And there are certain factors which points us in that direction. 2008, 2009, when the global financial crisis happened, that's when all these impacts and scrutiny on corporate governance started having. So there comes your governance angle. When we had issues like, oil pipeline leaks, et cetera, and, even data privacies and all those campaigns, that's when you started, okay, are we doing enough, from our impact perspective? And then this whole social gamut. So if you see and follow the sequence from that perspective, what's interesting to note is over the last decade or so, the focus on ESG has been tremendous. And as you started off, Mark, by saying, right, it's not just about your shareholders. Well, I think it's about the entire stakeholder mix, where you talk about not just your shareholders, but your customers, your employees, your suppliers, and more importantly, your communities. And we are seeing that happen, around. So I think this is something which is kind of evolving as we go, and the impact is profound, and everybody is looking and talking about it.
Ah, very good. Hey, Tim, you kind of started off this conversation, with that piece of it. Did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, I mean, just building on many. I mean, it's not a question of going one better, but I mean, I was working with some Danish companies back in the mid-90s, large global pharma companies, world leaders in insulin, and already then they were coming with, or kind of evolving. They weren't just doing their annual financial reporting. They issued an environmental report as a standalone document alongside the financial, the numbers. And then the following year, they issued, in addition to the financial report and their environmental report, they began to issue a social report. And this was, 96, 97, 98, those kind of times. And certainly in Denmark, they were calling this triple bottom line reporting. Now, I'm sure we could kind of plot all the different, the evolutions and when did the terms come. But from my perspective, that's how I recognize what we call ESG today, or what's evolved to ESG today. I remember things, back at, 24, 25 years ago, which then evolved, you could say, from triple bottom line reporting into, as one or two of the other panelists have mentioned, other initiatives, whether it's corporate social responsibility, CSR, sustainability, and so on. I don't think it's a natural path from those origins, but I think it's just from a global perspective, I suppose organizations have inspired each other. And certainly when I see the same pharma company in Denmark today, I mean, they're out there globally as one of the leaders in ESG. And I also see other, certainly in the bioscience sector, also, demonstrating. I saw a LinkedIn post the other week. Their CFO was commenting on their latest ESG report, and this is, like I say, in the bioscience sector. So I think it goes back years. I don't know if we can go back even, maybe even into the 80s, but certainly from my perspective, I started seeing this 95, 96.
Yeah. So, hey, Zane, I'm going to jump over to you and the UAE. Is there a different perspective there? Are you seeing something consistent with what Tim's talking about?
Well, I think that within the GCC, UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, a lot of the countries have set national agendas for 2030, 2035, 2050, very ambitious national objectives and national goals. In many cases, they've actually established elements of either social or environmental, and mainly it's because they understand, look, either the oil is going to run out, the global climate change is going to impact us. We have to really take this seriously. And so there's national level objectives that the government has set, and they're trickling down to semi-government and even encouraging private companies to support and work to meet and exceed those national objectives, whether they're for environmental or for social welfare.
Mm-hmm. Charlene, I see you've had your hand patiently up. I'm sure you've got something to add.
I'd like to follow up on Zane's comment because it is worldwide. And I'd like to follow on Tim's comment and tie both together. I do cyber resiliency, cybersecurity design for building and construction. And the company I work for, AECOM, one of the things that they do is they spend time letting their employees know, hey, this is what we're doing to impact the world. This is what we're doing to make the world a better place. And it's not just about the world or civilization or this, that, and the other. And I'd like to quote a comment here. AECOM is working with, as part of our integrated engineering and archaeological work with the Highways England on A1 motorway upgrade in North Yorkshire, England. The excavation of an ancient Roman civilization led to the unearthing of more than 62,000 objects, including some fantastic discoveries. So this, and I'm not promoting AECOM, I want to be very clear, this is a neutral panel, but it's an example of what a company does as far as taking what they do for a living and combining it with worldwide impact. So in the process of building this highway or upgrading what we're doing for this, they take time to discover, okay, we have this ancient civilization. We don't want to bulldoze over it. We want to learn from it. And at the same time, tie the two histories together. So it's what I want to bring to point is one human being, one company impacts everyone else on the earth, everyone else on the planet. And I think ESG is so much bigger than what we think it is now. Hence the gray area and the smoke and mirrors of what Simone was talking about. We're trying to wrap our heads around something that is both tangible and intangible at the same time.
Gotcha. So, as we're sitting here talking about this, I remember Tim and I talking about this subject a couple of months ago, and I was talking about ESG, and Tim said, well, is this similar to this? I believe it was CSR, and you mentioned that a little bit earlier. So a lot of folks from around the globe on this, and there's a lot of different terms and a lot of things this is called other than ESG. So, hey, I'm gonna go out and kind of see, is there anything else out there this is called? I mean, I'm not sure. Rocky, what are you seeing out there in Indonesia? Is it called ESG, or do you see something else?
Yes, I believe there is some saying, you can say. I believe the United Nations also call it SDG. Maybe it's kind of different, but it's also talking around the ESG area. But in Indonesia, we oftenly call it as CSR, but we also call it as financial sustainability. So there is a regulation related to the financial sustainability in the financial sector. And also we use like green coal, green energy in the extraction sector, Mark.
All right, great. Sounds good. Manny, what do you see from your end?
Well, I think the most important part around here is the sustainable business practices, right? If you look at any businesses, we are all part of the ecosystem, right? And what we do from a consumption perspective and what we give back to the ecosystem here is important. So that's why this whole discussion around, how can we become more sustainable and how can we provide more inputs back into, the net zero carbon pieces that we talk about, the 2050 rule. So that's important. Not to mention that there is a big financial impact. Sustainable based investments is more than $30 trillion right now. So that's a lot of money around playing in the background, but we do need to understand it from, all the three aspects.
Yeah.
If I know Simone's had her hand up for a while, but I'd like to jump on that. Little known fact, talking about the financial interest, for those of us who are old enough to remember, and that would be most of us on this panel, no offense. If you remember in the 1970s, there was the apartheid of the South African regime. There was a large disinvestment, financial disinvestment to the companies and the government that supported that. So this is something that's been around for a while. People choose to put their money with what they think is appropriate to their principles and value sets. So it's to a company's best interest to recognize that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Simone?
Yeah, I'd like to, there was a couple of things that came up both with Charlene, what you were saying before with the archaeological digs and things like that, as well as what Manny was saying, but both things for me. So it's a great example that you've got, an evolving a company that's actually helping, I guess, society move forward, looking at our roads and, connecting. I see that as connecting people. It's always been part of our human history to develop trade routes, right? So, but as a result of that, we're not the only epoch or the only era to have dug things up. over a period of
Right.
time. And one of the things
Right.
that really stood out for me in what you said was that, you know, that we found all of these items and this is how that they can work together with our history. But it depends on what we value, because there were many times where the Romans didn't value what was there and they just
Right.
built over the top, right? And they didn't care about that.
Absolutely.
And they're not the only society to have done that. So again, I think it comes back to this value creation and
Mhm.
what it is that we define. Our values are, you know, it's a physical expression of our values
You got it.
when we see
Absolutely.
what those impacts are in whichever country we reside.
Got it. Hey guys, for time purposes, I'm going to move. I think we've answered a lot on even the next question that I had for you guys. But you know, we've talked about a little bit about what ESG is. We've jumped into that. It's some really good stuff. But now we really have a view of what ESG is, at a very high level. Let's dig in a little bit. You know, there's a lot of articles, papers, opinions out there regarding what the scope of this thing is called ESG. And as I mentioned before, I felt like it seemed like the majority of those were focused on finance and investing, and we brought that up. Is that really the case? Or is the primary scope something different from ESG? Eduardo, I'm going to you first.
Okay, what I see is that, my focus is primarily on the governance part of ESG.
Okay.
But what I see is that we have large corporations and governments, large investment companies, consulting firms, advisors focusing on this. But let's not forget that ESG is about sound decision making. It is about sound decision making based on principles, based on values. And nobody's doing this because it's nice. And the ones that will try to just greenwash the topic, to just use this as a PR stunt and marketing, are going to fail, because it is for the long term. So the scope is immediate, where we are talking about complying with existing regulations and responding to what the stakeholders, that include everybody, the consumers, the clients, customers, the third parties, the government, society, investors. But also it is in the long term, how we are going to sustain that. So what I've been reading is many large organizations are failing in taking the first step. And I believe we can cover this a little bit down the road, but it is what is the next step that we can take now, but with an eye on the future, so that with the scope, it starts as small as we can deal with it. But we have to think of the scope broadening as we go over time.
Oh, awesome. Turhan, let's go to you next.
Actually, the primary focus initially was related to the investments, but now it's changing completely, because it's more than that. So actually, in order to understand the primary focus, we have to look at what drives ESG to be compliant. What are the drivers of the ESG? It can be customers, it can be investors, it can be mandatory requirements, reporting requirements. It can be also the getting value of resilience over efficiency, asset optimization. All these factors really drives the ESG. So the primary focus is not only the investment and the it is also something more. So we can see a lot of people at the moment, a lot of industries like banks, defense, aerospace, automotive, transportations, logistics, telecom, media, energy, utility. Everyone is trying to implement ESG now.
That makes sense. Simone, what about you?
Well, I think it's actually quite an interesting facet. For me, when I think about, you know, is it just about investing? I think it goes way beyond just the financials, that a lot of places I see look at, really, quite frankly, it's gambling. You know, it's taking a risky action, hoping for a desired result. But, you know, they're putting something, they're staking something of value, I guess, with the consciousness of hopefully the risk will gain them something, some kind of outcome. But that, you know, is still quite uncertain in many cases. And we just hope that they haven't miscalculated in what they're doing. You know, my grandfather taught me risk management at a very early age, started at the racetrack since he bred and trained racehorses. You know, but it was really interesting the way in which he did that, the way he introduced me to understand how to look at risk was, you know, how to read the boards, how to read the race form, account for external uncontrolled circumstances, the timing at which you laid your bet, I guess, and even which jockey and so on. These are all differences, you know, and the external factors of the weather and even when you do place the bet and you just watch the horse cross the line, it's still not officially a win until they declare it official. And I think all of this to me relates to what goes on in ESG because, you know, we are, the biggest lesson he ever taught me is you only bet what you can afford to lose. So there are some companies that can pour money into ESG, which is great and phenomenal if we get the right results, if it's focused the right way. But the decision-making competency really depends on their emotional agility and the value systems that they're operating on, both as an organization and an individual. And so we really need to understand risk management, the consequences of those decisions built into every day at all levels. So when we say, you know, only bet what you can afford to lose, it's also realizing that we're dealing with people's livelihoods, you know, that we're dealing with their organization's ability to provide back to stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Well, that makes sense. And you know, this scope is much more broad than I ever really thought it was. So if you consider the scope that we've been talking about, a lot of pieces here, environmental, social, and of course we have webinars coming up after this to go into a little bit deeper. Then what would you say would be a driver? So, you know, if you look at the poll we originally had, right, folks said, yeah, we're kind of considering it. And so, you know, if you were to nudge an organization and say, hey, there are some drivers of this thing. Tim, what would you say if I asked you, hey, are there drivers to going down this path of ESG? What about you?
Well, I think, Mark, you know, let's take the retail sector as an example. And I think, you know, if you look at some of the large global, the conglomerates, I'm thinking of the Unilevers, the Procter and Gambles, you know, who have an umbrella of multitude of brands. What we've seen those companies move towards is recognizing that in certain sectors, you know, consumers are becoming more discerning, and they're going to have to kind of understand, as Simone mentioned earlier, you know, the concept of values, well, the values of consumers. And we're seeing many, you know, consumers begin to question what products or what brands, how they talk to them from a value perspective. So, you know, some people will go and purchase a garment, whether it's a shirt or a pair of trousers, and they'll begin to ask questions such as, you know, where was that, what is that shirt made of? How much water was used to produce the shirt? What are the working conditions for the workers in the at the plant who produced the shirt? How was how was that shirt transported from the production factory to, you know, your country? And even in the retail outlet, you know, what are the working conditions? How well paid, or are they being monitored in the workplace, and so on? So suddenly people begin to question and align with values and expect some of the bit larger company or some of the companies who they're purchasing their products from to align with their values. And certainly, again, you know, in Denmark, what I see here is, there's a large organic movement, and this has been going on for many years. And I can pop into my local supermarket, and I will find that over half of the vegetable and fruit section is put over to organic produce. And generally, that organic produce costs 2 to 3 times more than non-organic produce. So supermarkets are recognizing the values of their consumers. And one word we haven't mentioned, actually, I think, even on the earlier question, is ethics. And that, people have a kind of the doing the right thing attitude, and people care about how well, workers are treated, whether it's in the retail shop or a production facility and so on. So I think it's around, a driver is around aligning to our consumers, our customers' values. And I would say in certain sectors, it's becoming more that the license to operate in that sector.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Actually, I like how you mentioned ethics. In fact, I've got a question coming up on that here in just a little bit. So I'm going to actually move on, guys. I think we've had some really good discussion on the overall scope of ESG, what it is. So let's jump into this a little bit. There are some really, really good piece of information out there about measurements that matter really regarding ESG. And we know that statistics generally focus on what we want them to. But when it comes to, say, environmental and social aspects, the statistics are pretty clear. So Manny, I'm going to start with you. Walk me through this one. What are we talking about with measurements in ESG?
Well, I think the important piece around here is to understand why these measurement criteria is important. And I always talk about Peter Drucker, who's the famous management consulting guru, who talked about if you cannot measure something, you cannot improve it. And there is this all talk about where are companies in the ESG life cycle, right? So if you look at it from that scorecarding lens, I think there are, especially in the US, there are specific companies who have come up with, different data elements that they can fit in. And they have pillars, the 3 pillars, the environmental pillar, the social pillar, and the governance pillar. And what's being done is looking at these pillars, evaluating companies across their impact and the time horizons of risk and opportunities. Now, when you look at companies per se, what happens is you understand it from the different ESG profile perspective, which means where they are in the ESG adoption lifecycle. Are they laggard? Are they average? Or are they leader? And I think this is where the ESG score is really important. And we are seeing different companies doing it. There are some companies from that perspective who have really good ESG scores, which makes them, even more better place when it comes to making decisions from investors to invest. And since I'm from financial industry, I specifically kind of harp on that fact that are you making it more financially viable when investors are looking at it? Be interested in the panel's talk.
Got it. Hey, Eduardo, off to you next.
Well, I like what Manny said, and we have a few consulting companies and providers, IT providers that have scorecards that are becoming a kind of de facto standard for scorecarding. But some are measuring too much, some are measuring too little. What is important is in regard to what Manny was sharing, is that a vision without a goal is just a dream. And I'd say that a goal without metrics, without a way to measure progress, may become a bad dream. So what do we, I'd say that like Refinitiv, it's a company, we are not promoting Refinitiv here. It's a company that has been gathering data from large organizations for a while, and they have a big repository now. And you can go online and we will share the links just for you to have a look as someone that is just trying to understand what a ESG is and how to measure it. You can see what kind of details we can have for each one of the metrics, for each one of the themes, environmental, social, and governance. But one caveat is that if we focus too much on just measuring, we might risk to forget our principles. We're not, this is just a race. Measurement here is to ensure that in the long term, we are heading toward our goals and then we are having progress. That's my key thought here that I would like to share, because I've been talking to clients that are so much concerned about the metrics that they are forgetting about clarifying the principles to their internal and external audiences and designing strategies to achieve their goals based on those principles. It's not just about the metrics. It is about achieving the vision that was set by the senior management in the beginning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Karen, you've done some research and worked in this area as well. Anything you're seeing from a measurement perspective?
Yeah, Mark, there's actually, I just want to make one comment going back to what we've been discussing. I know everybody has said that ESG has moved, it's beyond the investments, which yes, in a way is true, but I would posit that ESG decisions by any organization, it's really, the bottom line is it's all about the money. Whether you are looking to invest or whether you are seeking investment, that's really a primary driver. So that being said, I mean, there are a number of organizations that have come up with these ESG scores that we've discussed for companies. They're very similar to ratings agencies that help drive your stock price. Now, there are various algorithms, variations in the algorithms, but basically all of these use similar criteria, and I'll run through those real quick. Sure. So from the environmental perspective, and again, it varies by the industry that you're in, they're going to be looking at your impact on biodiversity, what your company may be doing about climate change, looking at pollution, and how you're using natural resources, and in some cases, water security. From a social perspective, these ESG rating companies look at labor standards that you might be adhering to, affecting how you affect human rights. Like, for example, if you're a manufacturer, are you using sweatshops and exploiting poor communities? Health and safety is big, and customer responsibility is also huge. And we're seeing this now, especially as at the point we're at with the pandemic. Companies that are maybe not handling re-entry to work, or they may be seen as endangering their employees with regard to COVID, they're getting dinged big time. From the governance perspective, they're going to look at anti-corruption. They're going to look at your overall corporate governance structure, if you even have one, how well you manage risk, and also a lot of them look at your transparency in terms of taxes and financial filings. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, well, so when you start talking about financial and tax filings type of stuff, hey, Charlene, I think you and I had a discussion about SEC, some common, not common areas. Any thoughts on that one?
We did. So when it comes to SEC reporting, right now, there's no, for the United States, there's no framework, there's no standard, there's no set of rules. There's two sides to this. The first is it costs a company money to put all of what Karen discussed, all of those statistics, all of those algorithms, to put it together in a report for internal and external dissemination for people to read and look at. So it costs money. It's costly to the company to prepare that. And if there's no one standard, if there's no agreement on what environmental social governance is and what you should report, then a company may invest in software or some sort of gathering of this data and information, and they're going to lose money. But the other side of the coin is any enterprise, organization, whatever, that continues to operate in the quote unquote status quo without taking into consideration environmental social governance, they're going to be hammered. Again, back to Karen's example, companies who are not taking into consideration employees having to return to the workforce because of COVID, they're getting dinged. So they're going to face higher costs either way. They're going to face higher costs by publishing this data, which costs money to gather, and they're going to face costs if they don't do it. So they're sort of in the damned if I do, damned if I don't. So without guidelines right now, it is difficult for a company to do it. The other thing is mandatory versus voluntary. If you don't have measurements, as Manny discussed, and those aren't some sort of standard that is agreed upon, then how can you require reporting? Now you're back to voluntary reporting. And whatever you voluntarily report, if someone else digs up information and releases it to social media, now the organization is in trouble. So companies have a fine line to walk, because I have to, as a company, as an organization, if the organization is for profit, they have a responsibility to stockholders, they have a responsibility to their shareholders, they have a responsibility to their employees, they have a responsibility to all the way down the line. Let's face it, they're in business to make a profit. So by the same time, there has been, from the 2008 fallout, this with CIOs and CEOs or whatever making these insane salaries, there's been a blowback. So there's a very difficult balance right now. And the Securities Exchange Commission is running to keep up, to try to figure out what they're going to do and what's going to be required here in the United States.
Gotcha. Hey, Manny, you work specifically in the finance and banking industry. Anything to add on that?
Well, I think it's interesting to see, and what Charlene was just mentioning, right? The requirements. And one of the things that's being closely monitored is the new ESG reporting requirements from bank. It's Greater Supervision in Banking Act of 2021. It's getting a lot of traction and momentum right now. And if you look at it, what's being proposed around there, it's still in discussion, is the reporting around the diversity of directors that you have, the involvement in projects that contribute to mitigate environmental harms, other forms of environmental impacts, taking actions on climate risk and contribution to climate change. And we have to kind of dial this back and understand, we recently had President Joe Biden kind of put together an executive order on climate-related financial risk. So I think it's all being kind of tied together. And if you see, there are, as the panel was discussing, there are certain industries, and I think Karen touched upon it, which have impacts, especially on the financial side of things versus the environmental side. So it's all kind of part of the same life cycle and same ecosystem as we look at it.
Simone, on to you next.
Yeah, I really like this talk around the, reporting and metrics and, standards and things like that. One of my favorite resources is the World Economic Forum and their various reports. Just go to their website. There's a whole host of them. But one in particular stood out for me in regards to this discussion, which was the Measuring Stakeholder Capitalism Towards Common Metrics and Consistent Reporting for Sustainable Value Creation. Now, in this, Forum's International Business Council have been looking at how do they rebalance that corporate purpose and, spearheaded some commitments from, a couple of hundred of CEOs to try and align their corporate values and strategies to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And we were just talking about, those, how do we sustain, what goals do we have and how are we going to develop those? Now, at the core of this work is that stakeholder capitalism metrics and the disclosures that they need to have in mainstream reporting on their performance against ESG, the indicators, and then track those contributions towards those sustainable development goals on a consistent basis. Now, that's a really difficult thing because they've flagged the existence. There's multiple ESG reporting frameworks, and the lack of consistency and comparability with them, with the metrics, are real pain points that's making it difficult for companies to, I guess, credibly demonstrate to all their stakeholders. I mean, wow, it's a lot of people to please, isn't it? On their progress towards being sustainable. So I think, one of the results of the process that they've been going through is they've now got 21 core metrics and 34 expanded metrics and disclosures, which the International Business Council members and council company members, that they want them to have around adoption. So have a really good look at it, because even the expanded metrics are looking to represent more advanced ways of measuring and communicating that sustainable value creation around ESG.
Makes a lot of sense, guys. I need to move on. We're going to jump into the human focus coming up next. But before we jump to that next slide, hey, I was talking with Eduardo, who had a pretty good quote. I think it's a great way to end this one up. Eduardo.
No, we were talking about the train is at that station. It's about to depart. If senior management doesn't move the company, or the organization doesn't move the organization to the train station now, they will miss the train. That's the thing. They will miss the train. Do not wait until the train departs to start moving to the train station.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of like we say on cybersecurity side, don't wait until after you had a breach to finally secure your system. So, all right, excuse me. Let's move on, guys. Next, hey, let's talk about this human focus thing. So based on what we've heard at this point, it sounds like, and I heard Tim bring this up earlier. And Karen, I'm going to come to you on this, because it sounds like we're leaning into some type of maybe an ethical dilemma of sorts, but is there a human focus to this and a link to business and community ethics?
Absolutely. As we've discussed, right, ESG really has been around in some form for over a decade, but it's not really been front and center. And what we've seen is the coronavirus pandemic and the rise of Black Lives Matter movement. Those became inflection points, and they began to underscore the importance of taking a hard look at how our economy functions, and really even how our overall society functions. And what I think is really exciting is that the discussion now has jumped beyond the boardrooms into communities of everyday citizens, right? So who does the current system work for? How can it be expanded so that we can include more people in the tent? And so for us technology professionals, I think it really compels us to look hard at how we are applying ethics principles to our use of technologies. So for example, let's take the concept of redlining. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's a discriminatory practice that puts services out of reach for residents of certain areas that's based on race or ethnicity. Now, historically, redlining resulted in the systematic denial of mortgages or insurance, things like that, based on location rather than on a person's qualifications or their creditworthiness. Now, it's definitely illegal today to redline. However, financial services organizations are embracing AI to make a lot of credit-related decisions. And so we're seeing a danger of redlining practices starting to creep back into the system through poorly designed AI algorithms. And we'll be doing a deeper dive on similar ethics issues in our upcoming webinars, because really ethics underlies all aspects of ESG.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And I think when you talk about financial services industries, and there's a lot of different aspects across the board. Hey, Manny, I'm coming to you. You're in the finance industry.
Well, I think Karen hit the nail on the head, right? With their comment. Ethics is the foundational component on which companies got to operate. And when we look at this, the example that you touched upon, if you want to unpack that a little bit and understand these bots, AIs, machine learning algorithms, if you look at it from a tech industry's perspective, how they've been used to make decisions And how do we ensure that they take the biases out of it, right? And there are 2 or 3 different ways companies are looking at it. Are we gonna go full blown on using technology to make decisions? Is there a soft touch element to it, which means they do most of the screening work, but the final decisioning is still being done by a human who is looking at it? And I think this removal of biasness is a key term. In US, particularly in certain states, you cannot use these to make decisions independently. There are laws which prohibits you from doing that. So I think if you look at financial industry per se, it's kind of, a wide range of spectrum. So if I can say that, some companies are using it for making decisions, improving their efficiencies and effectiveness, the way they want to improve their customer experience. Like, there are companies here where you can make mortgage decisions real quick. What goes in behind those algorithms, it's what organizations and regulators, et cetera, are trying to kind of, improve that and provide what you call the much needed transparency on that.
All right, nice. Oh, so great. So now we've hit that. Tim, if you're out there, I think you might have had something talk about value sensitivity. Are you out there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, just before I come to value sensitivity, just something building on a comment one of the other panelists have made, and actually, I should have commented on this earlier. I mean, certainly in Europe, we're seeing there's a new EU AI regulation coming. And as Eduardo said, it's a question of embracing that. So getting on the train now rather than waiting and seeing. But certainly where I'm living in Denmark, the Danish government also came with a law targeted mainly at the larger Danish companies, the listed companies, that they need to account for their ethical use of emerging technologies. And they need to actually account for it in their annual report. And this is mandatory. Alongside that law, there was also a scheme that's also been introduced this year, where companies need to also on their websites provide a so-called digital seal that's very focused on privacy and information security. That gives visitors, users of the website, the what would you say, the comfort that they're actually dealing with a company that's in control of its technology, in control of its processing. Now, coming to value sensitivity, I think this is a topic that certainly in the field I work in, which is privacy and data protection, it's becoming a need for people who are working in that field to be aware that not everybody shares the same values as, let's say, the people working in a company headquarters that may be located in, say, Western Europe. And you've got customers or even employees who are located in, it could be, other parts of the world, it could be Southern Africa, it could be in the Far East, South America, that, the values of the people who are designing the systems, the solutions, using the technologies, they need to be mindful that not everybody has the same values. So, for example, if as a result of processing data, there is an impact to an individual that exposes something about them. Now, that could be, exposure of someone's sexuality or their religion, which may not be a big issue in let's say, a Western European country, certainly in a country like Denmark, but in a country where maybe there's a repressive regime or the political system is very different. It can in some cases be a life and death situation. So we've got to be sensitive to the values of others. And there's various methods, there's emerging methodologies on how to work with this, how to literally take you out of your own set of values and place you in the seat of others. So I think this is going to be, from a skills perspective, we're going to need people in companies who understand this, but also can apply it in the use of, I'm talking about technology primarily here, in the design and use of that technology.
Yeah. So speaking of skills, I'm glad you mentioned that. That'll be actually, we're going to talk about the next question. But before we move on from this, I've heard AI a couple of times. Of course, we're talking about the human focus here, and I see a grin on Simone's face. I know that we've had a lot of discussions about AI, right, and the humanization piece here. So Simone, does AI have anything to do with this at all?
Oh, absolutely, it does. In fact, there's a lot of formidable issues that need to be addressed in that growth and adoption around it, especially from an ethics and human rights consideration, design and developing issue. Just in terms of resources, just to start with, I would really recommend people just look at AI Ethics Lab. Actually have a map, an interactive map that you can go in and use, which will show you all the different AI frameworks, ethical frameworks that are out there at the moment, because we've got OECD principles, which has been adopted by 42 countries. You've got the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. You've got the IEEE Global Initiative around Ethics and Autonomous and Intelligent Systems. You've got the European Commission's guidelines on trustworthy AI, UK, Australia, Canada, Singapore, Germany, and all these sorts of things. So, again, we're looking at trying to, how do we merge some of these frameworks so that we have a more consistent understanding, view and approach to it, just like we want to have globally on ethics and human rights from that perspective. I prefer not to use the term artificial. I really prefer to, and I think the way we talk about it in our language and the vocabulary that we use makes a big difference. Very much around looking at it as augmented intelligence or accelerated or assisted or actionable. When we use these kinds of words next to the intelligence, it means that it's augmenting our intelligence or it's assisting our intelligence. It's not separate unto itself as such. And therefore, we need to look at it. I mean, technology is about 5 years ahead of the legal system. So, we've got some interim issues that we need to really deal with in these frameworks and guidelines and bringing that ethical leadership into play. We can't outsource our responsibilities to machines. It's the key to the story of Frankenstein's monster. It's Frankenstein failed to take responsibility for his creation. He was so afraid of it, he walked away from it, and the monster just went out there into the world and the monster didn't know how to behave. It was never taught. It didn't feel recognized. So, I mean, just as a baseline from that story is we can't leave our technologies to their own devices. We have to take responsibility for making them and introducing them to the world, educating them, teaching it. We can't tell them what to do that if we can't reduce it to what we need to understand is ethics within our own rights, because that's what we're putting into it. And there's some great companies that are making some amazing steps that are so positive on the human aspect, whether it's from self-driving cars, whether it's to helping trauma victims with their hearing and their limbs, and there's some amazing stuff that's happening, which I think is brilliant. But also, too, it comes back to the measuring. So, for example, British Standards Institute are now looking and working with the ISO management systems to bring in a global approach to AI. So if you have a look at ISO 42001 that's being developed for an AI GRC ecosystem, also combining that with the ISO 23894 for risk management, and also with 38507 for governance. So guys, go out there, have a look at it, compare it to the way you are making your decisions around your design and development and integration of AI.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of common things we started talking about ethics and several things came up over the last couple of discussion points: education, teaching, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and those types of things, which is going to take me to our next question. And there's a lot to take in here, right? One of my concerns is that we may not have the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to really be able to address ESG properly. Do we need to really start thinking about upskilling or reskilling our current competencies helping or not? So Simone, you are hot on that last topic. I'm going to let you keep a hot mic. Why don't you kick us off on this? Because this is kind of a specialty area of yours.
Oh, well, I tell you what, investors are still looking at companies right now in how they're adapting their recruitment, training and development and retention practices across their corporate culture and their purpose to meet what's going on in the context of the new era, if you like. There's a lot of business leaders that understand that reskilling their employees is good, and looking at the coalitions on how they can collaborate across public, private, both cost effectively and mid to long-term dividends, not only for the enterprise, but also to benefit society more broadly by doing the not just upskilling. So in other words, helping people become more masters at what they can already do, but also repurposing what they know or learning brand new skills. So we're looking at both traditional and non-traditional competencies. How do we evolve those? And there's a lot of good frameworks out there. One of my favorites is the skills framework for the information age, because I know that it's been adopted by over 200 countries in how they look at what are all the decision-making competencies, our emotional agilities, the way we do, our talent management, if you like. And it's called talent because that's what you're hiring me for, isn't it? My talent. In Hollywood, they get paid a fortune for how skillful they are at adapting and engaging their emotional agility. Wish we had their pay packets. But it's really prompted companies to rethink their approach to talent management, especially around employee health and well-being. And I think the biggest point for me, and I hope you guys jump in on this when I say this, I really don't like the term human resources. I'm not something to be consumed and plundered. I'm not an asset. I'm not I'm a human being, not a thing. And I don't like the term human capital either. You don't own me, and you can't get more of me once I'm done.
That totally makes sense. I get it. Yeah. Hey, so what I want to do is, so we talked about recruiting training. I'd like to reference to Sophia. It's a really good framework, knowledge, skills, and abilities wise. So hey, I want to push over, and then Simone, you may want to back into this. Charlene, you've got a fair amount of research in history around soft skills, technical skills, right? Social skills. What does that have to do with our current competencies right now? I know Charlene was out there a little bit ago.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry about that.
Let's go.
Before I answer that question, Mark, I'd like to back up to Simone's point. Full self-disclosure, I'm deaf. I wear a cochlear implant. It's called a Nucleus 7. It's the latest device on the market. And having gone from a quote unquote physically capable, non-disabled person within the last 5 years to be deaf, I have experienced firsthand the discriminatory practices that are both willful and unintended. And so part of the emotional social governance is recognizing that people have different skill sets, and it doesn't mean that I can't do my job just as good. It means we have to change. I thought it was pretty fascinating, and I sent this article to my current boss when the pandemic hit and all of this virtual conferencing and stuff started happening. Companies were noticing that there was a significant amount of mental fatigue of their employees. And there was a research article by the National Institute of Health that said, you guys are finally seeing what those of us who are deaf with implants, cochlear implants or hearing aids or whatever, experience firsthand. Because I have to do mental gymnastics to understand the digital sound that's occurring in my brain. So a person who does virtual meetings for 6-7 hours a day, they get tired. I do meetings 6-7 hours a day. I'm exhausted and I have to crash in my bed. So I like Simone's example. Fast forward to your question, Mark. In the United States, we have the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. And there's a huge focus on soft skills. It's not just that you can hack behind a keyboard, you can, for the longest time in cybersecurity, which is my area, there was can you hack? Can you break into a system? Can you program? Can you do database? Can you do SQL injections? Can you do et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But we never had a way to adequately communicate in a tangible way that management, senior management, and the board could understand, look, if you don't have governance and some sort of policy, overarching policy that manages your technology and how you patch systems, et cetera, you have to do these things, board. You have to pay people to, with their expertise and knowledge, to manage this, because if you don't, you're going to have a breach. It's going to cost you in terms of social media, in terms of et cetera, et cetera. The pipeline, Colonial Pipeline, prime example, right? So there's a disconnect between the skill set of the technologist, the person behind the keyboard, the person behind the digital, and communicating that to the customer and to the board. That gap has to be bridged.
That makes total sense. Hey, Tim, I think you may have some input on this one for competencies.
Yeah, and really like what Simone was talking about. Totally agree with not liking human resources and so on. I'm going to call it HR just for sake of my comment. I mean, I think a lot of companies' HR departments need to also look at not just the use of technology in recruitment, but there's countless scary stories that we can read about around how people are excluded from recruitment, or inherent racist bias or sexist bias by algorithms that are filtering individuals out of a recruitment process. But I think in general, how companies tend to, once they have a short list of candidates, then what I've seen, it certainly here in Denmark, is they then put it out to the department and say, okay, we have 3 or 4 candidates, and they'll say to a colleague or a hiring manager, go and interview this individual. And the tendency is, and this is the affinity bias, is that people then tend to recruit people who are just like them. Maybe they have the same education, maybe they have the same skin color, same age, even the same interest, and I've seen this in companies where people come back and say, oh, they even like the same music, or they like going out for a beer at night. And then what happens is, companies then just recruit more and more people who are just like themselves. And what this requires, and I think when global corporations, and it comes back to what I was talking about value sensitivity earlier, is that we also need to be more diverse and inclusive in our recruitment, so that when we're looking at situations where we're using technology, for example, that we have broad, people with broad exposure, so broad inherent diversity and also broad acquired diversity, instead of the classic example I see often is, a team of lawyers from a legal department will be performing some privacy impact assessment, and I can only imagine it's impossible for them to understand what impacts could occur towards people in, let's say, a country in Africa or a country in the Far East and so on. So I think countries also need to start looking not just how they're adopting technology, but how they are recruiting, and how they, the existing practices that they're using are flawed by design.
Yeah, that makes total sense, guys. For the sake of time, we probably need to move on to our last question. But the things we just brought up here make a lot of sense, right? We're talking about competencies and training, which really takes me to this last point here: is are we moving in the right direction? Right? Would you guys say there are any steps or solutions either underway that are moving us in the right direction, or there are suggestions that we might have as we're talking to clients, and things like that, to help us to kind of get moving forward on this? What do you guys think? Rocky, I'm going to start off with you on this one.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Are we moving in the right direction? We are moving into a direction, Mark, but I don't know whether it is right or not. I think there are still a lot of things that we need to, I believe, enhance in implementing a good ESG. like for say, if we are looking at the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, where a lot of small, medium companies, just like my country in Indonesia, we have like 90% of small, medium enterprises here, where ESG is the stuff for large companies. So small, medium companies, their awareness is very, very little into the ESG. I think our issue here is also how to make it more simple, more principles. Every size of company in every location can understand and can adopt it, and the awareness should be understand by globally. That's what I'm thinking, guys. Mark.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Karen, I want to jump back to you for a second on this. If you had a follow-up, because of some of the things we talked about earlier that you shared with us, and I think there's a big link here.
Yeah, actually, I agree with Rocky that somehow we got to figure out how to make this a global trend, but I think that's going to be a long slog. But in the meantime, and given that our intended audience is, making ESG understandable and how, what does this mean to the technology professional? I really think that getting ESG more evolved, if you will, in our daily lives and our work, that it's got to be a grassroots effort. So I would say that, really focus on developing your understanding of ESG so that you can actually be a change agent in your company. And it doesn't matter what your role is, you can have an impact. They say that if the pebble dropped into the pond goes out into those ripples, I think that that's really an important concept. So learn how to make a business case for the various aspects of ESG for your particular area of responsibility. And if you're at the C-suite level, I think being able to express the benefits of ESG in your functional area is invaluable to your board of directors. Because let's face it, tech underlies everything we do. Like, I'm a CIO, and I would say that my role and my related colleagues' roles, CTO, CISO, et cetera, they can be really influential with the board of directors right now.
No, that makes sense. Hey, Zane, you got your hand up. What do you got?
Yeah. So, kind of bringing a lot of these things together, do we have the right competencies? Are we measuring the right thing? I think of this as, it's not just the technical and the soft skills, but it's also kind of the mindset and the willingness for the organizations to challenge themselves. If they're going to set soft goals or or push down the responsibilities to lower level teams to say, set some goals and let's go do them. Well, are those goals actually going to be valuable? Are they going to really add value to the overall ESG objectives? Or are they, does the leadership team and the organization have the mindset to really challenge themselves and understand what's going on and push themselves into these difficult conversations? Because these are very challenging and very complex topics. So from competency to the having a more, I want to say, open mindset and attitude, all of these kind of fit together to understand, are we now going to be able to move in the right direction? Getting those people, getting the technical skills and all these things, they kind of build upon each other so that you actually can have a direction. Hopefully it's the right one, right, Rocky? We don't know what direction is, but hopefully it's the right one. And you have to kind of build upon all these. And hopefully in some of the next sessions, we'll talk about some of those in more detail.
No, that makes total sense. So, hey, let's jump off to Charlene. You've had your hand up for a little while. I'm sure you've got a comment on this one.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to, I don't remember who said it. Maybe it was Eduardo or Tim or Turin, but the comment was at the very beginning, if you're waiting to jump on the train for ESG, you're going to miss it. So from a cybersecurity, cyber resiliency perspective, the C-suites, the boards, whomever, they need to understand that there has to be some sort of self-awareness to take a look at this, because failing to do that, you will be mandated, especially in the United States. Again, the colonial pipeline issue. Now, oil and gas pipeline operators must report all cyber attacks. So if a company doesn't take, or an organization or an enterprise doesn't take a proactive approach to deal with this and to try to educate themselves and become self-aware, figure out how they're going to do it and start having these conversations now, if you wait until you're mandated, it's going to be too late. And you're going to pay a price. You're going to pay a price big time financially, number one. You're going to pay a price in I'm not going to call them human resources, Simone, but you're going to pay a price in the talent that you're looking for. You're going to pay a price in your bottom line stock. You're going to pay a price in your social presence. And all of that is going to combine to basically crash your enterprise. So this is not something you can wait on.
You got it. Manny, off to you next.
Well, real quick, I know we're running out of time here, but
you feel like I'm pushing you guys?
No, I think this whole discussion is so engaging that you can talk and peel the onions as we start kind of looking at it, and I'm excited for the next series of sessions as we have. But one thing real quick, and Rocky touched upon this, right? We are moving, and that movement is important, because if you don't move now, you would be forced to move. And that's why we're seeing a lot of boards discussing it, CEOs looking at it and saying, okay, this needs to be top down. But what's important is to make sure that there is a sense of purpose, right? The corporate engagement should have the sense of purpose, right? And I would want to say that, if you see ESG focus improve, the society in general is improving. And that's the bottom line we take away from here.
You got it. Speaking of bottom line, let's go right to Simone. I can't leave you out of this conversation.
Oh, well, I just like the way that we're talking about forward movement and being on the train. We can do top down, we can do bottom up. There's a lot of different things we can do. But you know what? We started this series now by asking, what is the ECG on ESG? Where is our heartbeat? So ask yourself this question. Ask the organization, ask your people, and check it out against the new and evolving practices and measures, and see if you truly are making that difference. See, because you have to define what is your current rhythm, and if it needs a healthier diet, a pacemaker, or even a transplant before you decide on a course of action.
You got it. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much. I know we're getting really close to the end of this. Just want to make sure everybody understands that we are recording this, and we'll be able to get this out on our social media, probably here within the next day or so for you guys, because there are a lot of folks who didn't get a chance to join. You might be able to take a look at this later. So, our next focus session is going to be focused on environmental. And so if you guys have any questions or anything out there, hey, feel free to reach out to us out here on the chat or the Q&A, or you can send a message to any one of these experts out on their social media so that we can prepare for you guys. So next thing we're talking about, green with envy. We're going to start talking about the environment. So what I'm going to do out there on chat real quick for everybody, I'm going to put a link out there. If you have not signed up for that next one, feel free to go out there and sign up for it. Of course, you'll get an opportunity to see that that's recorded afterwards. So a little bit on that next one. You've probably seen that. Well, if you haven't seen this marketing sheet, you're going to see this will start coming out this week. And so this will be preparing for the deep dive we're going to do onto the environmental side of ESG. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to the esteemed panel. I appreciate your kind information and excellent stuff. For everybody, the same panel will be here, and we're going to jump in deep next week. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you guys next week at the Green with Envy discussion. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.